As we start working on the visual principles projects for this course, you'll quickly realize that there are quite a few rules for these two assignments. There is a visual rule sheet, which is what I have up here, which you're welcome to look at, but sometimes it's helpful if I go a little bit deeper and explain these in more detail. So I'm going to quickly go over these rules, and hopefully this will help make sure that you follow all of them correctly. This is a large portion of how this assignment is graded in addition to the communication, so it's really great if you understand these things and avoid making any of these mistakes. The first one is that all compositions must be square. This one's pretty obvious, I think. If you don't mess with the template or change the template, automatically everything is already set up for you as a square. So they can't be rectangular, they can't have rounded edges. Also, everything needs to be inside of that composition. So all of the shapes need to be contained within the square itself. One way that you can do this is with masking, which we go over in the software tutorial video. So you can have something going out of the square, but you can't see it as it moves out. You need to mask it so it's all contained within that square. Another fairly simple rule, no more than 7 shapes. So no matter what you do, you can only use 7 shapes in total. You don't have to use all 7, but you cannot use more than 7. Remember that each segment of a line is counted as a separate line. You can create lines like this, but I'm going to assume that each of these is a separate line because you're not allowed to use curved or zigzagged lines. Remember also that if you use a white shape, which you can do if you place that on top, like in this composition, that also counts as a shape. Another thing that can be a little confusing is that we're going to assume that the background of all of these compositions is the paper itself or the artboard in the file. So basically that all these compositions are clear almost. So if you turn the box black, I'm going to assume that there's a very large shape that's being masked or contained in that square that is making it have a black background. You can have a black background like in this example, but it will count as a shape. So keep that in mind. You cannot mix elements. So you're going to be working with point, line, and plane. So as you do that, you cannot mix lines with planes or lines with points. One thing that does get confusing is if you are in the planes composition, obviously you can use perfect triangles, perfect circles, perfect squares, right? But if you're in the points composition, you can only use perfect circles. So I know that gets confusing because there's a shared shape there between those two sections, but just keep in mind that you cannot mix shapes. So basically, if it's a plane composition, it can have circles, triangles, and squares. If it's a point composition, it should only be circles. And no line should ever be in a composition with planes or point. That's what this is going over. You can only use true shapes. So I talked about this in the software tutorial, but you can only use perfect shapes. This can be achieved really easily by using Shift, holding down that key when you're creating shapes, but they must be perfect squares, so no rectangles. They must be perfect circles, so no ovals or ellipses of any kind. And they must be perfect equilateral triangles, so no right triangles, isosceles triangles, anything like that. They have to be a triangle with 3 equal sides. You can overlap shapes. I talked about this in rule 2. You can have a white shape that comes on top of a black shape. So sometimes that can allow you to actually make shapes that may appear that they're not perfect, like in this last example. This looks like a right triangle, but what's going on here is there's a white square on top of a perfect triangle that is creating that illusion. And we'll look out for these things in the file. So you can sort of get around it, but in general, you want to avoid having any of these shapes on their own. Everything must be in black and white. There's no color on this assignment, so please ensure that you're only using black and white, no grayscale, no color. Avoid the Pathfinder tools. These are some tools that you might be familiar with in Illustrator. It's a whole palette that allows you to subtract and add shapes. It's very useful, but avoid it on this assignment. So this is an example of something that you could never create by overlapping black and white shapes. Everything you make in this assignment has to be just by layering black and white shapes. It's impossible to layer black and white points to get them to look exactly like this. This can only be done with the Pathfinder tool. So just avoid that palette altogether and you'll be in a great spot. Like I said in the other ones, you can do things like this though. You can't overlap shapes and create things that are interesting, but there will be certain situations where as instructors, we'll be able to tell that that's something that could never be created by overlapping those shapes. So just be mindful of that. Again, the best rule of thumb is just to avoid that palette and just play with layering those black and white shapes. You can only use solid shapes, so they must be solid black or white. You cannot use stroked shapes. So in this one, we're seeing shapes where they're just the outline, and I can tell that by the way that they overlap. So that's something you cannot do. One thing that gets confusing though is you can create the illusion of outline shapes. If you place a white point, like in this example, on top of a larger black point, and you center both of them, it actually sort of looks like an outlined point. So that is one way to get around it. Just keep in mind that I will count that as two shapes because that's the only way you can create something like that. So again, overlapping those black and white shapes is allowed. Just remember that those are now two shapes and that's how it will be counted. No imagery. This assignment is all about communicating without words, communicating abstract concepts with these simple shapes. So no imagery, avoid things like sun, smiley faces, mountains, trees, all of that kind of stuff. The goal here is not to create pictorial representations, so it's something that you want to avoid. And then I talked about it a little bit earlier on, but also only straight lines. You cannot have wavy lines or curved lines of any kind. You can't have lines that taper, so lines that go from thick to thin. You can have zigzag lines. I talked about this in rule number 2, but remember that every segment of that zigzag line will be counted as a separate line. So I hope that's helpful to you. We really want to make sure that you succeed on this assignment. If you're ever confused or have further questions, you can always email your instructor to get more help. But I think this should help ensure that you follow these rules correctly and will get a great grade on this assignment.